Rasti, jaslama dječjim, rasti i cvijetaj zemljoradnih ljudi i neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada. Mir tvojim lađama napuči i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, Tita.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. This is the evening of the 12th of November, and it is a live stream today focusing on, of course, our old friend, perennial favorite, a certain Mr. Donald Trump, who you may have heard is now President of the United States again. Uh, Let me know when you get tired of winning, as the man said. Now, if there's been any problem with the technicalities of this stream thus far, it is because I am using a new system. I have gone back to a system I used a while back, and what I'm doing is I'm trying to free myself from, shall we say, uh, corporate products. So using a Linux system um, rather than the Microsoft system generally has proved better. So I'm slowly moving my stuff over to that. Hence why there were some sound issues on the pre-show tunes earlier on. Some issues migrating that over. But here we are now, live and in person. Also, uh, the mic I'm using tonight is my headphone mic, which is uh, probably why you're getting a certain problem. If there's any issue with it, I'm going to turn it up slightly. Uh, right. So, audio a bit rough for tonight. I do apologize, but it does give it that slightly more authentic sound to it. So, uh, any issues will be sorted out because I'm getting a different mic tomorrow, tomorrow or the day after. So, I turned the sound up a little bit there to make compensate. So I will endeavour to press forward. So here we are. With due apologies for sound interference. As I said, issues will be resolved tomorrow. Talk about the amazing anti-deep state team assembled by President Trump. You really would believe that he's waging a great but very subtle fight against the those dreadful neocons by appointing them to all the key positions in his cabinet. What a heroic figure, seriously. But if you believe that, then, well, you're a person who got duped as bad as somebody who contributed to the Bernie Sanders campaign twice, once in 2016, then again for its pale shadow in 2020. You're probably on the same level as somebody who's still thinking that Jeremy Corbyn is going to return and lead you like a lost tribe out of the wilderness. So to believe that Donald Trump had a serious interest in tackling the the deep state, so to speak, which doesn't really exist. There is no deep state; it's just the state. The term deep state comes from um, scholarship done on Italy in the post-war period, with the idea that democratic governments came and went, but there was always this permanent set of institutions. Well, that's just the state under capitalism. That's just the state. The state in the United States, of course, being the premier imperialist power, is much more extensive and much more repressive, but it is still just a capitalist state fundamentally. And so the very usage of the term there leads you down a blind term deep state leads you down a blind alley. It implies that there can be some version of the capitalist state which isn't repressive, which doesn't have all of these secret police agencies attached to it. And of all the people who I would imagine was going to take a bold stride forward and take on the power of the Federal Bureau of Investigations, or the National Security Agency, or the Drug Enforcement Agency, the very last person I would imagine would do that would be Donald fucking Trump. His only problem with it is that it wasn't doing what he wanted. Same reason, same going all the way back to Richard Nixon. And we should bear in mind also that Donald Trump's, I think, formative political influence as a younger man was probably more than anybody else Richard Nixon. And it is the Nixon themes which stood out in his campaign. And we'll be returning to that later. But to get to the big ones, to get to the big news today, of course, is that Secretary of State, the American chief diplomat is going to be a certain Mr. Marco Rubio, who, of course, Trump belittled as a pathetic lightweight who was in the pay of Sheldon Adelson 10 years ago or 9 years ago. But now, of course, this pathetic lightweight in the pay of Miriam Adelson is just the man to oversee Donald Trump's foreign policy. Great stuff. America first and all that. And interestingly enough, there are some very curious details about our friend Marco. Our friend Marco, of course, has, as it turns out, according to reporting done um, by Anya Parampil in her book on the regime change operations run by Trump and his administration, his first administration against Venezuela. Marco Rubio featured, of course, very heavily in those plots and continued to do so. Marco Rubio, of course, is a proven liar, a, uh, a man who has lied about his own personal biography and lied about his connections with Florida drug traffickers, as it turns out. Now, Anya Parampil, in her book, which is entitled Corporate Coup, which I would recommend, by the way, there's some really interesting details in there. Um, with regard to Rubio and his connection to drug trafficking, she has the following to say. I'm going to quote from the book directly here. Leading the propaganda blitz, and this is the propaganda blitz against the socialist transformational government of Venezuela, was Marco Rubio, the Florida senator born into Miami's notoriously reactionary Cuban expat community. A middle-aged career politician with boyish looks and cowlicky hair, Rubio was once considered a rising Republican star, despite a questionable past. In 2011, the Washington Post revealed that Rubio had based his entire political coming-of-age story on a lie, though he repeatedly spouted a cliched South Florida tale of his parents' escape from Fidel Castro's socialist hellscape. Immigration records demonstrated that the Rubios had in fact gained permanent U.S. residency nearly 3 years before Cuba's 1959 revolution, meaning they had actually fled the regime of the country's US-backed military dictator Fulgencio Batista. Aside from pathetic dishonesty, Rubio's character was tarnished by revelations that throughout the 1980s, his brother-in-law, Orlando Cecilia, directed a $75 million cocaine smuggling ring out of his home in West Kendall, Florida. Cecilia was convicted of drug trafficking and sentenced to 35 years in prison in 1989, but released early in the year 2000. In his 2013 memoir, Rubio, who by then featured Cecilia at numerous campaign events, claimed that he was unaware of his brother-in-law's criminal activity and had been stunned by news of his arrest. Yet a 2016 investigation by the Miami New Times cast doubt on the senator's account, revealing that as a teenager, Rubio had actually lived in the home at the center of Cecilia's drug operation. So that's your new Secretary of State. Proven liar, family connection to the drug trade. So if ever Marco Rubio, as he will, starts babbling on about battling drug cartels, well, he should know because he has a direct family connection to a drug dealer, a man who did time for drug trafficking. Though $75 million worth of drug trafficking is relatively small time, really. I mean, if he'd multiplied that by 10, then he could have easily been a major investor in a Wall Street bank or hedge fund. So that's Rubio's background, proven liar and the brother-in-law of a drug trafficker. Now, what about the things that Rubio's got himself involved in? Because as Anya Parampil points out in her book, this guy is like one of the leading proponents for the forcible removal of the Venezuelan government, led by Nicolas Maduro. And he was all over the Trump administration's regime change operations. He was there on the border, jumping around like a coked-up teenager, and the border between Colombia and Venezuela, trying to stage some kind of provocation, all of which failed. And so this is one of his major obsessions, one of Rubio's major obsessions, aside from the usual things about rabid hostility to Iran, rabid anti-China views, rabidly, of course, supporting the U.S. colonial state in the form of Israel. Um, but I would say Rubio's primary obsession is regime change in the land that his parents came from, even though they fled Batista, Cuba, of course. Regime change in Venezuela is his other obsession. So he's invested in all the way across the regime change operations in Central and Southern America. So this is I'd say his enduring obsession is Venezuela. It's his white whale, so to speak. And so appointing Rubio as Secretary of State is a good indication of where things are going to go. Now, one person who was actually quite impressed by this was a certain Senator John Fetterman, formerly, of course, a favorite of the likes of Sam Cedar. Senator Fetterman is, of course, to use Tucker Carlson's very accurate uh, characterization of him, a rich guy playing dress up. He's a rich guy who likes to play dress up as a skater, despite the fact he's far too old to be wearing hoodies and jeans shorts. This is what Fetterman does. It's, as Carlson accurately said about him, it's a costume. Fetterman is a rich guy who's never had a real job, who basically just coasts around doing fuck all and has coasted into a senator's gig, despite the fact that like he had a severe stroke and needs a computer assistance to write anything or apparently say anything. But that shouldn't necessarily get in the way, of course, of a very long and very distinguished career in the Senate, where even mortality itself is no barrier to actually serving many decades. As long as a corpse can be propped into position by a couple of interns and its hands stuck up at the right time, you can be a senator post-mortem for decades as long as the right preservatives are applied to your corpse. So, Fetterman, very delighted. He said in a tweet today, um, unsurprisingly, the other team's pick will have political differences than my own. Evidently, the operating system's not firing too well today, because that sentence was very badly worded. That being said, says the AI that's writing Fetterman's tweets, my colleague, Senator Marco Rubio, is a strong choice, and I look forward to voting for his confirmation. So Fetterman's already on board. And by the way, don't think that this is just Fetterman being a rogue agent. Fetterman has no control over his communication devices. This tweet is written for him by Democratic Party leadership. He's very close to the Democratic Party leadership in the Senate. So your former left-wing favorite, in fact, probably still current left-wing favorite, is very enthusiastic about Marco Rubio, and you can take it from Fetterman's endorsement that the Democrats in the Senate will vote for him with very little cross-examination of his background. Certainly, they won't be raising the impolite questions that Anya Parampil brings up in her book about his relationship to the drug trade and the fact that he lied about his past. And that's just before we get into any of the other rumors about Marco Rubio and family values, which I won't go into here because, of course, he may sue. But needless to say, Marco Rubio believes in family values. He believes in family values so much that he apparently has more than one of them, allegedly. But moving back into territory which won't see me in court in the United States, Rubio, of course, represents, aside from rhetoric and aside from MAGA branding, complete continuity with Tony Blinken. The only difference really being is that the new occupant of the Secretary of State's position, Rubio, will, of course, not be playing guitar solos and doing bad Neil Young covers in downtown Kiev. I'm assuming that Rubio will avoid that, though apparently, according to his own biography during the 2016 campaign, he is a very big fan of electronic dance music. So maybe he'll go to a rave in Kiev. Maybe you'll see Marco Rubio pilled up off his chump, sweating away in a downtown Kiev warehouse, partying it up to some EDM with the Azov battalion. I wouldn't rule it out. But back on some more serious points. Rubio, for all the branding differences, represents continuity. And again, Fetterman tweeting that out should give you the clue. Because again, that's not Fetterman's tweet, even though he probably does think that, but that's come direct from Democratic Party leadership. They're very happy with the choice of Rubio. It's continuity. Continuity policy on Ukraine, which, as I've said before, is a slow exit from Ukraine, trying to keep the war going whilst getting themselves out of it and dumping the problem on the Europeans. That's the American policy now. It's where the ruling class consensus has shifted to. They failed, but they can't admit that they failed. Trump will continue with that. Rubio's the man to do it. 100% commitment to the continued support, of course, for the colonial project in Israel and its preservation at all costs, because, of course, that means really the preservation of the US occupation or occupations in West Asia and the ability to try and continue to dominate West Asia via Israel, via the various the networks of US military bases, both acknowledged and unacknowledged in the region. So again, total continuity there. The only difference between a Rubio Secretary of State ship and the Blinken one will be in the messaging. It will be in the branding. Now, as I discussed with Kit Clarenberg in our inaugural edition of our program, Decline and Fall, which we have another one of those coming up this week, by the way, the whole issue about what the Biden administration's policy was can be described as, and this is something that we discussed, myself and Kit, that the Biden administration, like the Democratic Party they spring from, were convinced that if they could just find the right messaging, the right bullshit, then they could basically paper over or cover up the cracks in their party that were emerging due to their being complicit in the genocide that's going on in Palestine right now. And that's what lay behind all of Biden's bullshitting. If they could just like pretend enough that they were interested in a ceasefire, if they could just pretend enough that they were serious about wagging their finger at Netanyahu, then they could continue to carry on with the real business, which is making sure Israel's got all the weapons it could possibly ever need and continuing to allow flows of financing, both official and unofficial, out of the United States to Israel. That's the real policy, because that is where the interests of US imperialism lie. The only difference going into a Trump and Rubio administration is going to be, or Trump and Vance, I should say, with Rubio as their chief diplomat, will be that this will now be something, the support for the genocide will be celebrated. It will be crowed about. It will be, the administration will demand openly that everybody falls into line behind this or gets arrested, basically. That is that will be the policy. The difference is in the messaging, and this brings us, of course, to another diplomatic appointment, and that is, of course, Elise Stefanik, a former staffer for George W. Bush, a rabid supporter of US imperialism. Of course, you have to be to serve as long in Congress as she has, and now a woman who believes in the defunding of the UN relief agency UNRWA is going to be a rabid and foaming at the mouth UN spokeswoman, UN ambassador for the United States. And of course, this is again representing continuity. Linda Thomas Greenfield has essentially played that role for the last 4 years. She has done all the same things that Elise Stefanik will do. Only thing is, Elise Stefanik will scream and shout and bang on the table, bang a fist on the table about how amazing Israel is and how dare you and all that, and won't bother with the sort of slimy bullshitting that Greenfield did. But it'll be the same message, which is, no, we're backing Israel, fuck you. We're backing the genocide, fuck you. That will be it. That will be, and rather than looking awkward when they veto something, Stefanik will be overjoyed to be vetoing something. So again, this is a matter of difference in presentation, not difference in practice. Now, we look at other diplomatic uh, areas, other areas of diplomacy. What difference will Rubio's appointment make, or Stefanik's, in terms of approach to Iran? The approach will be the same. And the approach will be the same both in the positive and the negative sense. In the negative sense, the rabid hostility of Iran towards Iran will stay. The rabid hostility and the constant attempts to stir up regime change operations, that will be completely consistent. But then again, that's been completely consistent since 1980. Doesn't matter who's in there. The only difference is that again, sometimes there are tactical differences. So Obama, for instance, was representing a slightly more sophisticated form of imperialism, thought that the JCPOA and the opening up of relations with the more pro-capitalist comprador elements in Iran would aid a regime change operation there, encourage the growth of the comprador elements. It's a smart policy. It's worked before. Trump came in, and of course, not really knowing why he was doing it, tore up the JCPOA, and it's never come back. So, again, the rabid hostility towards Iran will remain. The attempts at regime change against Iran will remain. The only difference is that whereas the Biden administration would hide behind women's rights and hide behind gay rights, it's less likely that Rubio will do that. He will just say that Iran is our enemy, we must destroy it, which, if anything, is a little bit more honest. What about the Chinese connection? What about relations with China? Well, relations with China have deteriorated massively over the last decade. The relationship between US imperialism and the Chinese started to go very much south after the crisis of 2008, and it was Obama who signaled a shift in relations with China by setting up the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Remember that? That was the first turn in this game or the first sign that the US was now actively going to try and prevent further growth in the Chinese economy. And this, of course, coincided with the rise to the general secretaryship and presidency of Xi Jinping. And Xi represented a change in the uh, balance of forces inside the Chinese party. As we've covered many times before, he represented a shift back towards, or should we say, I think maybe back would be the wrong word, forward towards a new balance within the party. Having had a long period of pro-market dominance, having had the growth of comprador elements, the more revolutionary wing of the Chinese party gained in strength. There was a new balance was reached inside the party. The Xi leadership clamped down on the comprador element and and arrested the treacherous elements in the system. Started imprisoning CEOs who'd exposed themselves to blackmail by foreign intelligence agencies, and shut down a lot of the CIA and MI6 networks in the country. This, of course, will only have increased the rabid hostility of the US imperialists and their British sock puppet. But again, from Obama to Trump wasn't necessarily a big jump. It's merely an evolution in policy. From Obama's TPP, which Trump tore up, and again, just replaced it with something, didn't replace it with anything, but basically the idea died because the system moved on. You go from TPP, which was meant to drain investment away from China and into countries in the Pacific Rim who would be more favorable to the United States, more pliable with regard to US interests. You go from that you go from that to Trump's trade wars, tariffs and subsidies against Chinese goods. Biden keeps a lot of those on, doesn't really change it. Trump comes back in again, will intensify the trade war. It won't do any good. You can't revive U.S. industry that way. Again, like this is fundamentally about the rate of profit, not about any not something that any tariff system can fix. And Trump will double down on protectionist measures. Biden didn't really reverse Trump's protectionist measures earlier. He talked about it a lot, but no agreement was really reached. And the relations between China and the US, of course, deteriorated. Why? Because US imperialism's situation has deteriorated, and therefore they absolutely required the defeat of China and its subjugation. Chinese know that very well, and they know very well that the election of Trump will only bring more of the same, even if they, of course, use their usual rather elliptical language in saying that we welcome the opportunity to address points of concern, etc. There'll be meetings, there'll be talk, and of course the trade war will get worse, and the hostility of US imperialism towards China will get worse, and eventually Trump is going to get pushed or will just walk into some kind of increased attempts at provocations over Taiwan. That's what a lot of people, including Rubio in his administration, and those floating around his administration, people like that fucking scumbag Eldridge Colby, that's what that group wants, because that's what US imperialism and the US ruling class require. They need the defeat of China. They need to stop its rise. They need to stop its rivaling them, in fact, beating them in scientific and technological areas. They're removing the comparative advantages that US imperialism has enjoyed for so long. And for those reasons, that is why they require the defeat of China. This would be true whether it was Trump or whether it was Harris. The only differences are going to be in rhetoric and possibly a few differences in tactics. That's going to be it. So that's Rubio and Stefanik. But the other, in addition to Rubio's biog here, to go back to his South American connections, we could have expected, and indeed we should expect, a much more strident and rabid policy towards any country in Central and Southern America who is advancing their own sovereign interests. Now, that goes, of course, for Venezuela. It goes, of course, for Nicaragua and Cuba. But it also goes for Mexico under now President Sheinbaum. And her administration, following on from her close ally Lopez Obrador's administration, has had a decent degree of success in terms of increasing the wages of the Mexican working class, alleviating poverty, and proceeding with a genuinely progressive pro-worker agenda in Mexico. This is going to come under great pressure from the usual selection of interests inside the United States. In fact, and we've covered this before, the way they are going to try and do this, and this points to another one of Trump's appointments, Michael Waltz, Florida congressman, rabid, again, supporter of US imperialism. Of course, that goes without saying. But Waltz co-sponsored a bill with Dan Crenshaw, remember him? Who, eye patch guy, who proposed setting up, declassifying the Mexican cartels, of whom more later, as terrorist organizations, so that an authorization for the use of military force, an AUMF, could be used to justify military force against the cartels. Now, I'm currently reading a book which makes a powerful argument that the things described as drug cartels do not actually exist in the way that they have been presented. When I haven't finished it yet, but when I finish that book, I will be doing a whole program on its thesis. I would love to get hold of the author for an interview, but I'm not entirely sure he speaks English, and my Spanish is nowhere near as good as it would need to be to carry out such an interview. But the drug trading operations that exist in Mexico are subject to a lot of the propaganda and bullshitting by US politicians, and not just on the rabid Republican side. The Democrats are just as invested in this narrative. Pete Buttigieg was going on about this 4 or 5 years ago when he was running for president. Remember that? And so it's a common talking point. You see Carlson going on about it. You see that bilious old reactionary Douglas McGregor going on about it. And so this idea that the Mexican cartels, so-called, are to blame for narcotics addiction problems inside the United States, especially the fentanyl problem. Of course, this is bullshitting to evade responsibility for their own failures and their own driving of large numbers of the American population towards addiction through extreme alienation and despair. But what they are seeking to do, Waltz and Crenshaw, with this bill, what they were seeking to do, and this is only from last year, is to establish a precedent whereby the executive branch, the president, can launch military operations, not just like covert raids into Mexico, which they do all the time anyway. I'm pretty damn near certain of that. But full-on military operations nominally against the cartels. Now, the argument made by the book, which is entitled "The Cartels Do Not Exist," is that what actually do exist in Mexico are criminal operations which are really in the service of ultra-reactionary interests inside the Mexican ruling class, and of course have a direct connection with the US government, the US ruling class, US intelligence services. That's what's really going on. So essentially what Crenshaw and Waltz, whether they know it or not, I suspect both of them are pretty stupid, but what they're what they're doing is they're essentially applying war on terror logic to Mexico. That's what they're aiming to do. Rubio is, of course, all on board with this, but the reason why they're doing it is for the same reasons they conjured up the specter of Al Qaeda, something that they had been working with for decades um, in West Asia, to justify military interventions and to crush countries on the grounds that they were harboring terrorists. Scheinbaum, I think, President Scheinbaum, seems to understand this, seems to understand that there are those inside her own country who would seek direct US intervention. She has compared them in statements that she's compared the Mexicans who want this in statements she has made to the traitors of to Mexico in the 19th century who were demanding that the imperialists impose an emperor on them, which they did briefly in the form of the Emperor Maximilian. And the Mexican government and President Sheinbaum herself do appear to understand what they're up against, which is, of course, the first step towards being able to tackle it. Trump himself appears ambiguous on this question. And again, it will be interesting to see how this goes. But clearly, this, with the appointment of Rubio, with the appointment of Waltz, who's directly implicated in these schemes, clearly this is something which is getting off the ground.